Thank you for the invitation to participate in this international conference. The title of my presentation is Language Development Issues, Intercultural Competence, and Critical Thinking. So what is intercultural competence? Intercultural competence has been defined as the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations based on intercultural knowledge, skills, and attitudes. We live in a globalized world where even the smallest interactions in our daily lives can take place in a global level, thanks to advancements in telecommunication. Our multicultural society demands that we develop intercultural competencies and explore new methods, processes, content, and resources to develop these competencies that will help us succeed in today's world. The multicultural world has made intercultural teaching also necessary. It should focus on students' ability to comprehend quickly and accurately, and then act appropriately and effectively in a culturally complex environment in order to achieve the desired goal. Intercultural competence is important for successful communication across cultures, and so is critical thinking, since the two, if they're not parallel, at least they overlap. The Association of American Colleges and Universities defines critical thinking as a habit of mind characterized by the comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas, artifacts, and events before accepting or formulating an opinion or conclusion. Harper, 1994, shows that students are more motivated in their learning if they're stimulated by activities and discussions that are relevant to their own interest, and which help them to see parallels between the content being learned and their own experiences. Through the study of foreign languages and cultures, students gain insight both into their own native environment and into other ways of viewing the world by means of making critical cross-comparisons. In that respect, studying foreign languages provides a means for strengthening critical thinking skills. Mallen's 2010 found that instructors making a critical thinking approach to explicit for students, modeling it for them, and then inviting them to attempt their own critical thinking can help both in developing those skills and in creating a positive classroom environment. Critical thinking involves an examination of propositions of any kind which are offered for acceptance in order to find out whether they correspond to reality or not. The critical faculty is a product of education and training. It is also our only guarantee against delusion, deception, superstition, misapprehension of ourselves and our earthly circumstances as well. According to Sumner, 1940, education is good just as far as it produces well-developed critical faculty. In many class current settings, however, students are not expected to explore anything of their own, nor are they required to perform any tasks involving observation, analysis, and assessment of foreign cultures or languages. They do not have much chance to practice critical thinking and thus realize that cultural diversity with its own internal validity and value is a norm, and any culture is multidimensional. So these are some of the factors involved in, some of the skills involved in critical thinking. They have to do with interpretation, analysis, evaluation, inference, explanation, and self-regulation. So as part of interpretation, for example, is categorization of the facts or decoding the significance of some of the facts. As part of analysis is examining those ideas and identifying arguments and analyzing those arguments, whether they're valid or not. Evaluation is assessing certain claims. Inference, querying the evidence, conjecturing alternatives to that evidence. Explanation, stating results, justifying procedures, and preventing arguments. So all of these are some of the skills and sub-skills that are involved in critical thinking. And I try in my classrooms to take advantage of all of these skills, to implement all of these skills. So a considerable number of class activities activate only lower order learning and thinking. So they focus more on recall rather than reasoning, and do not engage students in genuine intellectual work. So I try to avoid those. I try to avoid just basic memorization or recall in my classrooms, and I try to get people to do more critical thinking. If we want to generate curiosity, the activities must evolve into a disciplined inquiry. In other words, every answer should generate more questions. and never take anything for granted. And that's what I tell my students in the classroom. So I'm going to be used as an example in my demonstration, a thought-provoking question. Critical thinking may be initiated very often by posing such a thought-provoking question, and then you ask the students for their reaction. So this basically integrates active learning by having the students apply critical thinking to the material. So the question, the thought-provoking question that I raised in this example is, was Spanish a consequence of an accent from Iberian speakers? Now, I have to discuss some of these terms that I'm using here. For example, the term accent, foreign accent. There is a long-standing myth that real bilinguals have no accent in their different languages. So there is nothing negative about accent. As a matter of fact, a 2018 article by Roberto Reagudo in the New York Times was rightly titled, "Everyone Has an Accent." So there is nothing wrong with having an accent. The question is, does that accent have an effect or not? Indeed, having a foreign accent is in one or more languages is the norm for bilinguals. Not having one is the exception. And there is no correlation between one's knowledge of a language and whether one has an accent or not. So there is no negativity to the idea of having an accent. So the question is, did this accent have an effect on the development of Spanish from Latin? Okay, so the question that we're asking is, so the variant of the Romance language, Spanish language is one of the Romance languages that was spoken in the Iberian Peninsula that derived from Latin. Was that form of the Romance language that we call Spanish due to an accent of the native population? So let's look at some of the facts that we know about the native population. The native population was non-Indo-European in the Iberian Peninsula, and it's only later that the Indo-European groups came into the peninsula. So the arrival of groups descended from the shepherds of the steppes of Eastern Europe came about 4,000 and 4,500 years ago, and they involved the replacement of approximately 40% of the local population, but it's still 60% of the native population that was there. Okay, so that's what when I refer to the Iberian population, those are the people that I'm talking about. Now, we have to distinguish between those non-European languages that were there for the longest, which is presumably the group of the Vascones, Aquitanos that you see at the top in dark orange, okay, and the ones that are in yellow and lighter orange that were non-European, but presumably came later. Okay, so they're non-European. They were there when Latin came. Both groups of non-European languages were there, but they came at different times. The ones in lighter, in white and blue are Indo-European groups that came later. Okay, and they basically settled on top of the native population. So unfortunately, we don't have any record of the non-European language spoken by the tribes that are in light orange and the yellow. We do have record of the language that is spoken by the Basques at the top in dark orange, because that language is still spoken to this day, and it's called Euskera. So that's the evidence that we have to use. Okay, so let's look at the lexicon. We have some writings that have been deciphered from Iberian, and we see a certain correlation between the Iberian language and Euskera. So there was some contact between the two languages. So, for example, Iliberris versus Iriberri for new city, B versus Ni for I, Salir for Zilar, meaning money or silver. You can see the similarity between the two. Bios versus Biots for heart, Biscar for back, Biur for twisted, Ilum for dark, and so on. So there is some sort of overlap between the two languages. Now, let's look at the phonology of the Basque country, of the Basque language. So if you look at So first, let's look at the Spanish, actually. So you see that in the derivation of Spanish from Latin, Latin had a number of sounds that then derived into an affricate sound in Spanish. So for example, centum, meaning 100, or celum, meaning sky in Latin, would give ciento and cielo in Spanish. That later, at a later stage, would come to be the interdental th that is characteristic of Castilian Spanish, ciento and cielo. So that tse sound, that affricate, is only occurs in Castilian, but it doesn't occur in another Romance language, for example, in French. So for example, you have in 100, from centum, we have cent, okay? And for cielo or celum, we have ciel, but we don't have cielo, okay? So basically, the affricate is only present in Spanish, but is not present in another Romance language in the Iberian Peninsula, in another Romance language. So let's look at the Basque. You see that the affricate is also present in Basque, okay, and that other non-European language. You can see the affricate. You have affricate se, and tra. So the question is, since they have affricates in the Basque language, could that be why that same affricate came to be in Castilian Spanish, but you don't see it in French? Since it was already there, it could be that foundation that triggered the language in that direction. Okay, let's look at the morphology. Latin had a very rich morphology, verbal morphology in particular. So you can see that they had different moods, the indicative and subjunctive, and then you have different tenses and different aspects. So you have imperfect versus perfect and so on and so forth. And everything was done synthetically in the morphology. However, when we move on to Spanish on the right top, we see that there are some gaps. So for example, the subjunctive has been reduced, and then there's a clear gap in the perfect that was basically eliminated, the morphology for the perfect. That was replaced with compounding forms, as you can see at the bottom, okay? So that you can see that in Spanish, the perfect forms were created using the verb haber, to have, and then the past participle. So I have eaten, and so on and so forth. So that's the compounding form that was used for the perfect in Spanish versus the Latin. So the question is, how did that come about? Did it come about due to the foundation, to the native population? One interesting fact that I want to mention first is that actually this kind of moving towards compounding was already present to a certain degree in Latin, but not as active as in Spanish. So you can see, for example, when we go from the active to the passive, in the passive voice in Latin, there was already also the creation of some compounding, in particular in the preterite and the perfect forms. So what this shows is that the trend that we see in Spanish towards compounding was already kind of basically inherent to the Latin morphology, and Spanish just pushed it a little bit further. So the question is, why did it push it further? And so when we go to the Basque language, we see the compounding forms also in the morphology of the verb in Basque. So you have the future, the imperfect, and you have the perfect stem. And so the thing is that there seem to be compounding in Basque, just like there's compounding in Spanish. So the question is, could it be the case that Basque, or that native language, pushed Spanish towards these compounding? So basically, the same way that we see in the phonology, that the presence of the affricates triggered the presence of the affricates in the native language, presumably pushed the presence of the affricate in Spanish. Could it also be that the compounding that is present in the non-Indo-European language, that is Basque, also pushed Spanish to have the compounding forms? So basically, the conclusion could be, well, it could be because, we see it in Spanish, we don't see it in French, we didn't see it in Latin, we see it in Spanish, and then since Basque have it, maybe it was the that basic foundation of the native population that pushed that. However, there is a counter argument. Most scholars now believe that Iberians could have come from North Africa and spread in Hispania, southern France, Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. Those Iberians assimilated to the native population. However, the Iberization did not touch the northwest of the Pyrenean Peninsula, where Basques or Vascones lived. So there was not a lot of contact. So they didn't superimpose themselves on the Basque. So the similarities that we see between Basque and the Iberian language are basically coincidental, but they're not strong enough. So the coincidences that we see between Basque and Spanish are really misleading. In fact, all attempts in linguistics to prove a genetic similarity between Basques and Iberian have been unsuccessful. The most probable variant is that Basque nation is the synthesis of Aboriginal tribes who used to be more numerous in Europe in a very ancient epoch. So basically, the Basque language is independent from the Iberian language. So any correlation that we see between the Basque language and some of the results that we see in Spanish are just coincidental. So the reason of part of the similarities between Spanish and Basque might be due to a language that acted as a linguistic substratum to both, what we can call a Proto-Basque language. When the human group that later gave rise to the Iberian people arrived in its final settlement and received its influence. So what we see is the influence of this Proto-Basque language, but not really the Basque language or the Iberian onto the Spanish. A parallel between Spanish and Iberian can be drawn, although with a difference of 2,000 years. Spanish and Iberian would share the Basque substratum, and that maybe that's what was the trigger. But like Spanish and Basque do not have a common origin. So Iberian and Basque do not either. Okay? So the similarities that we have between Basque and Spanish are just basically coincidental. So we really cannot conclude from that the fact that we have an interdental fricative, interdental affricate in Spanish is due to the non-European Iberian language, and the fact that in the morphology we have a compounding, and so does the Basque, does not necessarily mean that maybe the Indo-European pushed Spanish in that direction. So the coincidences in lexicon, phonology, and morphology between Basque and Spanish do not necessarily prove that the accent, what we call in the accent of the Iberians, determine the resulting form of the Spanish language as is derived from Latin. So basically, this is the kind of the reasoning that we want to encourage in students. So the conclusions are basically misleading. You know, you have to look at the argument, but then you have to look at other facts in order to corroborate those hypotheses. So it's fine to get to derive a hypothesis, but then you have to be very careful to also examine that hypothesis and revise it with new facts. And that's what we normally do in the classroom. So I don't present the students with the facts already given. I present them with evidence that could lead in different directions. And it's the students in the discussions in the class and in the thinking and the critical thinking that takes place in the classroom that would get to different results based on additional evidence. So that's basically what we really want to do in the classroom. So I conclude with a selected bibliography or some of the references that I have mentioned in my presentation. And again, I thank the organizers of the conference for giving me the chance to discuss my views about intercultural competence and critical thinking and how it is tremendously useful in the classroom and is something that we should definitely encourage. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.